Well, yesterday we began talking about the issue of loneliness, and I mentioned that studies have found that we have an epidemic of loneliness in our country today. That 20% of Americans feel like they're totally isolated. They have no real meaningful social interaction with another person. I mean, I've seen it so many times where I'll be in town, I'll be at a store, and somebody will just stop and start talking. Somebody that I don't know, they don't know me, and they're just starting to engage me in conversation. And I realize that these are often people who are very lonely, and they're just yearning for somebody to validate that they actually exist. Someone put it to me one time that they felt like they were invisible, that people no longer saw them, and they were just simply fading away and no longer had any interaction. And as I said, that the authorities now say that we've got an epidemic of loneliness in our country, and they said it's really, really a serious health risk, because they said mortality associated with chronic loneliness is higher than obesity and equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Well, when you realize the number of people who have all sorts of health issues, whether it be obesity, which they say that 25 to 35% of the population in America is morbidly obese. When you think about the number of people who have heart conditions and have diabetes, and in fact, 95% of people who died of COVID had at least 4 comorbidities like heart disease, diabetes, and things of that nature. And so when you think that loneliness itself can add to this and make it even many times higher, you realize that there are a lot of people who die early, at least earlier than they needed to, because they simply were alone. In fact, there was a study in one small town in upstate New York. It was made up of all Italian immigrants who were 2 and 3, 4 generations in, but they'd all come from the same area of Italy. They all knew each other. And they spent their life interacting with each other. They ate meals together, they visited together, and they found that the elderly lived longer. They had the lowest rate of heart disease and cancer of any group of people that they could find in the United States. And they were trying to figure out what was it, their diet. Well, they ate a lot of pasta, they drank a lot of wine, and they couldn't figure out, well, what is it that makes them, they're putting butter in their food, they have all sorts of animal fats. All the things that we used to think caused heart disease, now we know doesn't necessarily. But what they finally came down to was the fact that everybody in that community felt safe and secure. Even the elderly knew that there would be people who would include them in their social gatherings, that they would be cared for in their illnesses. If they had economic difficulties, there would be other people who would bring them food, who would provide whatever need they had to have. In other words, they felt like they were part of a community that loved them and valued them and would take care of them. And I think that this is amazing, because that was really what defined the early church. Even one of the Roman critics of Christianity who talked about what a weird group they were, and yet Pliny the Younger said at the end of his report to the emperor about who these Christians were, he finally said, "But oh, how they love one another." And he went on to say how that they live so sacrificially and giving for one another. They have such a sense of community, and people will live at risk for one another. In fact, in many of the pandemics, and when people were running away from the cities, Christians were running into them to care for the sick and the dying, and many of them became ill and died themselves. But they died giving a testimony of love and service and sacrifice. So one of the things we have to understand is that God made us to be part of relationships. And I often point out to people, you can only know really about 50 people, be acquainted with about 50 people, but to really, really be close and know people intimately, we only have the capacity to do that with 2, 3, 4 people. And in fact, I find my wife and I only have a few couples in our life outside of our immediate family that we're pretty close with, because it just takes so much time and energy and length of relationship in order to build that depth of relationship. Well, the point I want to get to before I get to my second point is that the reason why this is a problem and becoming worse isn't just because of what happened during the COVID thing. I mean, COVID, we had masks and we had lockdowns, And if you're like me, the mask made interaction almost impossible. In fact, the very fact that you were wearing a mask was essentially saying, I'm going to give you something or you're going to give me something. Now we realize, at least those who are willing to admit it, that the masks make absolutely no difference whatsoever. There was no protection provided there, but it did separate people. It did isolate people, and the lockdowns were 100 times worse. In fact, the pandemic COVID spread faster during the lockdowns than they ever did when people were getting out and mixing with each other. Well, anyway, enough time spent on that. But you see, the problem was that made evident how lonely many people were. But what did we do with our loneliness? We turned even increasingly to viewing life on screens. I call it a digital tyranny because basically TV and computer programs and things of that nature are designed to draw you in and hold you. The longer they can hold you there, the more they can push their products and the more they can promote. The more you interact on Facebook or Instagram or things like Twitter or whatever, the more they can charge their advertisers to target their goods towards you. So the whole system, even though they themselves know is incredibly unhealthy, is designed to generate more and more money from them by holding you tighter and tighter to the screen. And we find many younger people finding it impossible to integrate or to interact in any meaningful way with other people. They just don't know how to sit down and have a conversation. And so I see it at the airport all the time. Everybody is in their phone or on their pad or their computer. We used to sit at airports and we had nothing to do. If you didn't have a book, you often engaged in a conversation with somebody who was sitting around you and just talking about stuff to fill the time. Not anymore. Now people are completely caught up in their gadgets. And if they're not traveling with a close friend, they're not talking to anybody. So, or at least unless they're complaining to the airlines because they got bumped or canceled or whatever. Anyway, but we have this digital tyranny and it creates faux friendships. They're not real friendships. We have people that we interact with on social media. And what's even scarier is now the development of the metaverse, which is nothing more than really a self-created video game where you're the hero and you allow people into your metaverse, your world that you created. And they're even talking about creating meta jobs and meta vacations so that really you can begin to do all of life through a screen. And when you step back and look at that, I think this is so much like a bad form of science fiction. Why would anybody want this? And yet we have younger generations who have known nothing different. In fact, it's gotten to the point where now they're launching meta churches. In other words, you will create your avatar and you'll go to the church service and sit there and listen to the sermon. You'll be in a meta group where you meet on the computer. You don't ever have to leave your room. You don't have to get up out of your chair. You can live your entire Christian life in this context. The only problem with that is it's pretend and it's not real. I mean, that's something that people love about the internet is because you can portray yourself being anything you want. You can show other people what you want to show them and keep other things completely concealed. You can be two very different people. You can have a godly metaverse presence and you can have a very ungodly metaverse presence. And increasingly, this is creating some serious problems. And I say that even in terms of being parents, one of the most common deceptions I've heard from parents is when they'll say, well, I don't give my kids a lot of quantity time, I give them quality time. And it's really, what a clever way of not telling the truth, all I can say is, because if you're going to be good at something, you better give a quantity of time at being good at it. When I hire a professional to do a job, they usually do it not only quickly, but they do it well because they've done it so many times over and over and over again. And that's what we find, that the more we do something, the better the quality is. And the less you do it, the less the quality. So parents who have just passing interactions with their kids, they see their kids 5 minutes a day and then they're off, or they pass them on to the iPad, don't really have a quality of relationship. They've just given them basically a pat on the head and moved on. And this increasingly has become the case even in families where the family gets together around the TV set and husbands and wife will sit each other watching the same show if they can agree on what they're going to watch. But the long and short of it is they become like married single people. They are watching similar programs, but they're not sharing anything as far as life is concerned. And I think this is what's leading to other things in our life, where we talk about people who are choosing not to have kids at all and are opting out just to have pets, which is a whole nother dynamic. But again, I'm out of time. If you allow me, I'm going to continue this conversation because I think this is such an important issue for our time. So many blessings. I'll join up with you tomorrow.